Laudetur Jesus Christus, praise be Jesus Christ. This is Matt Gaspers, managing editor of Catholic Family News, and I'm joined as always by my friend and colleague, Dr. Brian McCall, who is the editor-in-chief of CFN. Hello, Brian. I hope you're doing well today.
Yes, it was a really good week for the liturgy this week. A lot of interesting days.
Yes, indeed. So we're coming to you today on Friday, July 17th, 2020, and today, in the traditional Roman rite, is the feast of Saint Alexius, who died in the year of our Lord 404. And just a little brief excerpt about his life from my hand missal says that he was the son of the senator Euphemian, and he renounced all earthly things and departed as a pilgrim to Palestine. He returned after 7 years, and in his father's house was taken for an indigent beggar. And today's epistle really emphasizes his renouncement of, or goes hand in hand with his renouncement of earthly things. And I think it's a good message to open our newscast today, especially the last verse is one of my favorites from St. Paul. So this is from the first epistle of St. Paul to Timothy, and it says, "Dearly beloved, godliness with contentment is great gain." Just as a segue, we have a series in Catholic Family News right now on Catholic social teaching, and that verse there reminds me of the article in the forthcoming August paper about distributism versus capitalism. I think you'll find that very interesting. So contentment, or godliness with contentment, is great gain. For we brought nothing into this world, and certainly we can carry nothing out. But having food and wherewith to be covered, with these let us be content. For they that will become rich fall into temptation and into the snare of the devil, and into many unprofitable and hurtful desires which drown men in destruction and perdition. For covetousness is the root of all evils, which some, desiring, have erred from the faith and have entangled themselves in many sorrows. One man who certainly comes to mind when I read that verse is Theodore McCarrick, perhaps the most notorious in our recent days, but there are many others, I'm sure. So this epistle ends, St. Paul saying, "But thou, O man of God, fly these things." So in other words, flee from these things, and pursue justice, godliness, faith, charity, patience, meekness. Fight the good fight of faith. Lay hold on eternal life. And several of our stories today, the verse, "fight the good fight of faith," is really a good theme for several of those stories, because we're certainly in the fight of our lifetime in many ways for the faith.
Yes.
Also throughout this week, we observed the anniversary of Our Lady's third apparition at Fatima. Monday was July 13th, and that's a very important, perhaps second only to the miracle of the sun on October 13th, because it was in July when Our Lady showed the three children, the vision of hell, and gave them the great secret of Fatima, the third part of which we still have not seen the actual words of Our Lady. We've seen the Sister Lucia's description of the vision, but not the actual words of Our Lady. We also observed the feasts of St. Bonaventure on July 14th, the great seraphic doctor of the Franciscan order, who was a close personal friend of St. Thomas Aquinas. And I believe they actually died in the same year, 1274.
Yes.
The year of, wasn't that the Second Council of Lyon, I believe?
Yes.
Yes. And then also St. Henry on July 15th, who was a medieval German king and also the Holy Roman Emperor in his day. And lastly, Our Lady of Mount Carmel yesterday, a great Marian feast day. So
Yes,
as Brian mentioned, it's been a great day, a great week for feasts and anniversaries on the church calendar.
Yes, and a connection. I mean, at Fatima, Our Lady, makes the connection explicit to Our Lady of Mount Carmel and the scapular.
Yes.
Showing its importance for our time.
Yes, Sister Lucia, as I understand it, used to say, she would tell people that the rosary and the scapular go together. Our Lady wants us to pray the rosary and wear the brown scapular. The scapular is a sign of our personal consecration to Our Lady.
Yes, very true. Well, our first story is another follow-up story to our ongoing coverage of the Amazon Synod debacle. that we
Yes.
throughout 2019 and 2020. And as our viewers and readers will recall, we very early, at the very, really the first few days of the Apostolic Exhortation Amazonica Quaerida being issued by the Vatican, came out very clearly to say this was not good news, and this was another manifesto for the further decomposition of the church by revolutionary forces. And again, not everyone took the same position. Many people celebrated it, thinking they dodged a bullet, was one headline, that it did not implement the radical changes that have been predicted by the Synod. And again, we've maintained our position, and we keep seeing further and further evidence that we were right, that the Pope's intention is to continue to push forward with radical changes that are at the very heart and foundation of the divine constitution of the Church.
In some ways, I'd say it really mimicked the documents of Vatican II in that it placed time bombs, as Michael Davies, the famous phrase, or as
Yes.
one of the modernist theological experts at the council, I think it was Schieldbeck, said that they put things in that they knew how they would draw out the conclusions after the council, something to that effect.
Yes, yes. And we had more confirmation this week. This coming from the UK Catholic publication, The Tablet, had the original report, and then LifeSite's Micah Hickson has a summary and sort of report on the Tablet report. Well, what's important is the Tablet is reporting some statements by Bishop David Martinez de Aguera Guinea, I think, I apologize for my pronunciation, of Porto Maldonado, who is the vice president of the newly established Amazon Ecclesial Conference. Remember that name, we'll come back to. So this bishop, who is second in command at this new thing, says, quote, he, Francis, thinks that the Amazon region, this Amazon Ecclesial Conference, is a testing ground, a practical application of the Second Vatican Council in the form of church life. So first, an important connection that Pope Francis is saying he's just implementing Vatican II, that he is just taking to their logical conclusions the principles there. And what is this testing ground? What is new or novel? Well, the bishop here, together with some comments of Cardinal Humes, who is the president of this thing, and who was the
ringmaster at the Amazon
Yes.
Synod. Yep.
Who was the real face of the Amazon Synod publicly during the Synod. They both confirmed what Francis means is a restructuring of the constitution of the church. The church was founded as a monarchy with Christ as the king, ultimately, right, of the church, and then the Pope as his vicar on earth, and with each bishop as a monarch in their diocese. Well, these people say, well, that the Pope very carefully, and in fact, they attribute to Pope Francis the name of this thing. Again, has no canonical or historical precedent. That's why I keep calling it a thing, because it just is a total novelty. But they say that he did not call it an Amazon Episcopal Conference, which, although a novelty in the way it's been used since Vatican II, does have some history to it. Is a sort of group of bishops coming together to sort of share ideas and exchange ideas. But he says, very importantly, Francis used the term ecclesial conference. And he points out that's because it is not just run by bishops, and that the bishops have a role, but that it's to involve other clergy and laymen and lay women in the decision-making process for this decision-making body that he now attributes it to. So again, this is radically altering the divine constitution of the church, turning it into a, in Francis and their own words, synodal church, which is nothing more than Protestantism, which Protestantism devolved when it destroyed the hierarchy, devolved just into these parliamentary gatherings where, as it happened in the 1930 conference in Lambeth, the Episcopal or an Anglican communion, quote unquote, came together and voted to approve contraception. So it's an idea where even doctrine, not just practices, everything is just up for popular vote by these people in these groups. And again, according to Pope Francis, this is in continuity. There's a hermeneutic of continuity between this and Vatican II. And to underline that, another quote from the Tablet report, the bishop is, concerning the role of women in this new ecclesial body. The prelate, Martinez, added that they, meaning women, will play a leading role, just as they do in the local parishes of the region. Quote, this Amazon Ecclesial Conference wants to be incarnate in those faces and the faces of women as protagonists in the church is a very clearly defined face. An Amazon Ecclesial Conference in which women did not have an important part would not be Amazonian. It would not represent the Amazon church. And again, this comes to exactly what we pointed out, and which has been confirmed now by many other sources. The goal of the document was to strip the priesthood of everything except the bare minimum of confecting the Eucharist and hearing confessions. And that was it. And the entire other roles of the priest as prophet and to preach the word of God, and as governor to govern the church, have been stripped away and are to be given to lay people and particularly to women. The article goes on, the bishops to confirm that deaconesses and married clergy are not off the table. The Pope, as we pointed out, endorsed the final document of the Synod that encouraged these practices, these aberrations. And this ecclesial commission, the ecclesial group has been set up to further, among the radical changes, those same issues. So those issues are not off the table.
And I think it's also significant just to reiterate that Pope Francis, according to this Bishop Martinez, refers to the Amazon as a testing ground. Well, the implication of that is that it's going to be expanded throughout the rest of the church. If this is the little petri dish and the experiment works, whatever that means to them, then the intention is obviously to spread it throughout the church.
Exactly. So again, whatever they come up with when it's this deaconess thing, it's just to be tried out there, and then we'll reach coming to a parish near you soon is what that means.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. Well, thank you, Brian, for that update, and we'll continue following this story. I'm sure there'll be plenty more to report, and we thank our friend Micah Hickson. She does an excellent job reporting on all of these developments, and especially news coming from around the world, international perspective. So we have another, I guess this is kind of another update story. We've been covering a lot in the last few weeks, the vandalism, the iconoclasm that's been breaking out throughout the United States and even around the world. And just last Saturday, July 11th, 2 churches here in the United States, there were fires at these churches, one in California and the other in Florida. And I think Brian is displaying
the California one.
Correct. So this one, significantly, we've also reported that Father Junipero Serra has been a particular figure of on the receiving end of hatred and acts of violence. You know, that's where it was in San Francisco, where a statue of Father Serra, the famous Franciscan missionary priest, was torn down and graffitied and desecrated in a park in San Francisco. I think the same thing happened in Los Angeles and perhaps other locations. So he was known for founding a series of missions on the coast of California. So this church that was burned, and we still don't know technically or officially don't know the cause of it, but I think it's, given circumstances of what's been going on in the country recently, I think it's pretty safe to be highly suspect of arson in this case. This is one of the mission churches that Father Serra founded way back in the year, you see the article from CNA gives the year somewhere here. I believe it, the late 1700s, I know. Yes, here we go. Founded in 1771. So a very, very old church. The CNA, Catholic News Agency, report says a massive fire devastated an 18th century mission church in San Gabriel in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, July 11th. And Archbishop Gomez, who's the ordinary for Los Angeles, tweeted about that after it happened. CNA report says the fire, good. The fire began early Saturday morning around 4 a.m. and destroyed the roof and interior of the 249-year-old structure. Local firefighters said they responded to an initial alarm at 4:24. By the time they arrived, smoke and flames were visible from outside the church. So it's kind of reminiscent, actually, of the the tragic fire in Notre Dame last April that we covered, and I do have an update about something regarding that in just a few moments. So that's kind of a summary.
If the cause of this fire is sort of speculative but unknown, the second one is definitely known in terms of a cause.
Exactly right, and it's one that happened rather close to where you currently are. Isn't that correct, Brian?
Yes, in Florida. And here's a picture of the Queen of Peace Church now. And what happened is early Saturday morning, a man drove his car through the door, just smashed into the church and poured gasoline all around and set it aflame. And you can see the damage.
While there were parishioners inside, correct?
Yes.
Waiting for morning mass.
There were people inside. There was not a mass going on at the time, but they were inside preparing things in the church, doing things. Fortunately, no one was killed, but certainly that this man didn't seem to care about that. He was arrested and charged by the police, but not for what this is. I mean, we should call things by their name. This clearly was an act of terrorism. And this particular church, some of the reports, the CNA report did mention it, but it is a church where the traditional Latin Mass is celebrated Sunday evenings. There's a priest of the Fraternity of St. Peter that comes down from Sarasota to offer a Latin Mass there every Sunday evening. It didn't confirm that went on last Sunday, but they were saying they were making other arrangements to have the church hall function as a temporary church. So I haven't heard if the priest came down for the traditional Mass last Sunday as a result. But again, this is, what most important, I think it was important to point out these stories is they were, aside from Catholic News Agency and a few local reports in the two local areas, virtually nothing in the national news about this, nothing. The news that, hypes everything that they can, and I would bet if this had been a mosque or a synagogue, would have been all over the news as a hate crime, but because it's a Catholic church, doesn't even need to be reported on. I mean, I kept looking all week. Oh, surely it'll come up somewhere. The national media completely silent about it.
And it also goes to show you how quickly these black, quote unquote, Black Lives Matter, Antifa type rioting in the streets, it doesn't take long for that to escalate into violence specifically against the church and against Christians, against Catholics. Happens very fast. And sadly, if nothing is done about it, we could see more of this. We'll have to see what happens. Hopefully not, but we'll definitely keep you posted on that. So I mentioned a moment ago, the fire in California reminded me of the fire that devastated Notre Dame in Paris last year. And there has been an update this week regarding the spire being reconstructed. And thankfully it's a good update, some good news. It was announced earlier this week that the spire of the famous cathedral in Paris, which was destroyed in last year's Holy Week Inferno, will be rebuilt according to its original design. It's not going to be some newfangled, modern, ugly monstrosity. It is going to be restored according to its original design. So that's good news. So we move from that historic monument to another one across Europe and into the Bosphorus, as it's known. The famous cathedral of Hagia Sophia, or Holy Wisdom, in Istanbul, Turkey, which of course used to be Constantinople for many centuries, really the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire and the capital of Eastern Christendom. CNA published, as many other outlets covered this week. So it was announced on July 10th, a week ago, that Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has signed a decree converting Hagia Sophia, the former Cathedral of Holy Wisdom in Istanbul, back into a mosque, which is really tragic news and should be upsetting for all Christians, Catholics, Orthodox, and otherwise, because it's, when a building is built as a church, it's consecrated for divine worship. And obviously it's a desecration of a church to have false worship going on in there. And that's exactly what's been happening in that magnificent cathedral since the year 1453. that's a year that all of us Catholics should commit to memory, because it's the year that Constantinople, the city of Constantine, which was founded, I believe, in the year 330 by the great Emperor Constantine, was overrun and subdued, conquered by the Mohammedans under the Ottoman Turks, the Sultan Mehmet II, I think, if I remember correctly. So it's a huge blow to Christendom for the fall of Constantinople, and from the year 1453 to the early 1930s, I believe, it was converted into a mosque, and was very common. You know, when the Muslims would go on jihad and conquer an area, they would convert the churches into mosques, kind of rubbing it in the face of the Christians that they had conquered, that this is now our land and we're worshiping our God and it's our religion now. And it should be concerning that President Erdogan over the years has seemed to be an advocate for a sort of return of the Ottoman Empire. And I noticed one thing, a Lebanese journalist by the name of Jinan Musa pointed out a telling difference in the English versus the Arabic versions of President Erdogan's press release regarding this announcement about the mosque. And here's what she says on a Twitter post. So in English, the English version of the press release says, Hagia Sophia's doors will be, as is the case with all our mosques, wide open to all, whether they be foreign or local, Muslim or non-Muslim. But then she points out, and she has them side by side in her post, the Arabic version of this same press release contains this line from President Erdogan: revival of Hagia Sophia, meaning its reconversion into a mosque, it's been a museum since the early 30s, is a sign towards return of freedom to Al-Aqsa Mosque. So that's interesting. But he's he has a long history of being very pro-Islam. He kind of strikes me as being somewhat similar to Vladimir Putin from Russia, in that Erdogan, like Putin, clearly wants to restore the former glory and power of his nation. And for Erdogan, that means a resurrection of the Ottoman Empire, which really means a resurrection of the Islamic Caliphate to dominate the entire world. I mean, Islam, as I've discussed in articles and conference talks that I've given, sees the world as divided into two spheres. You have the Dar al-Islam, which is the abode or house of Islam, and you have the Dar al-Harb, which is the abode of unbelievers. And until the whole world is Dar al-Islam, then they are to wage jihad. So stay tuned to our next paper, the August paper. We're going to have an excellent essay on this subject in light of the announcement about Hagia Sophia by one of our contributors, Timothy Flanders, who's done a lot of study on the Christian East as well as Islam. So stay tuned for that.
Yes, and it's important to emphasize, because a lot of, in the West and in America in particular, I think don't appreciate how significant this church is, Eastern Christendom. It is, it is the church of the Eastern side of the church. It's where we celebrate the exaltation of the Holy Cross, when the cross was recovered.
You could say it's the equivalent of St. Peter's Basilica for the East.
Yes, it is the equivalent of that. It's where the Holy Cross was brought back in triumph when it was recovered from the Persians, which we celebrate September 14th on the exaltation of the Holy Cross. It would be as if St. Peter's, for us, our perspective, were turned into a mosque. And it is, again, being a museum isn't great. It's sort of a secular purpose, but at least there was not, as Matt said, false worship going on in the building. So very sad.
Right. So as we close up this story and move on, I just wanted to emphasize, I came across a really interesting and very telling quote from Mr. Erdogan, who's been in politics for most of his adult life. I discovered, I wasn't aware of this before, that in the mid-90s, he actually served as mayor of Istanbul, which is where the church is located. And just to give people a little background, when the Ottoman Empire fell after the First World War, eventually there was a new secular Republican government set up by a man, last name is Ataturk. He's kind of the founder of modern day Turkey. And his vision for the nation was to be a non-religious, a secular nation state. And so for many decades in Turkey, being pro-Islam and being more, traditional Ottoman was highly discouraged. So in 1998, when now President Erdogan was mayor of Istanbul, he publicly read the following line from an Islamic poem, which, if you can imagine, in 1998 actually earned him a 10-month prison sentence from the secularist authorities. Obviously, people probably wouldn't bat an eye now if he said it, but back then it was illegal. So this is what he said, quote, "The mosques are our barracks, the domes our helmets, the minarets our bayonets, and the faithful our soldiers." So I think that really sums it up right there about, what the significance of Hagia Sophia being reconverted back into a mosque.
Yes, yes. Well, for some balancing good news, we go a bit west into Central Europe, and we go to report on some developments in Poland. This week, the results of the presidential election were finally announced. They have a system similar to other European countries where there's multiple rounds of voting. So there'll be several candidates, and no one will have an absolute majority because there's so many candidates, and they'll have another round whittling it down. So usually there are two candidates, and then whoever gets the most votes. And so the current president, Andrzej Duda, was reelected. And his Law and Justice Party is going to stay in power. And they defeated Rafael, again, apologize for my pronunciation, Trzaskowski of the party Civic Platform. And what was important is, and this was even covered by the mainstream media, this was a real critical election for the Poles because there was a stark contrast of not just detailed policy, but philosophy of what the Polish nation is. And President Duda has ran on a platform and has advanced a platform of protection of the Polish family and Catholicism. That Catholicism, Polish history, and Polish family life are to be protected and promoted. So he has, worked for, restricting abortion, which the European Union wants widely available everywhere, but restricting that. He has been very outspoken against the recognition of LGBTQ agenda, to encompass all of it. Whereas the party that opposed him made themselves very clearly on the other side of those issues, that they were going to be bringing Poland into the modern world, the modern European Union, and aligning Poland with these liberal revolutionary agendas. And the European Union has been very sort of not happy with Poland under Duda, and was really, the elites there were pushing hard for him to be defeated. The media running up to it was celebrating that he was going to lose, saying there's no way they can win, there's going to be all these votes against him. Reminiscent of the 2016 election here.
I was just going to say, it's hard not to think of President Trump when I hear about President Duda.
No, very similar. And they won, not by huge majority, but by close to 52% of the vote. He won to serve another term. Again, we'll see. Hopefully, he will follow up on the platform he ran on. The radicals are not giving up, however. And the younger people are being swayed into the revolutionary agenda. His own daughter, who's residing in London, I'm not quite sure, I think she may be going to school there, set out a tweet sort of undermining her father supporting the LGBT agenda after his election. So there's a real cultural war going on in Poland, which up until now has survived communism, survived atheism, to really hold fast.
Survived Islam as well.
Survived Islam, yes. To hold fast to the Catholic faith and to really support the traditional family, traditional moral values. But this was a hard-fought election, and fortunately he won. And to come to your point about President Trump, there is an interesting connection. President Trump visited Poland when his trip to Europe. It was very little reported on by the media. He gave a really, really good and interesting speech in Poland, praising the Polish people for their fortitude, for their remaining true to their faith, for their love of their country, the great love of Polish values. Again, it was a speech not really covered at all by the media because they didn't like it, obviously. Interesting, and showing an admiration for President Duda and what he was doing to preserve the greatness of Poland. And again, that's a lot of people say about President Trump, oh, he's so harsh on other countries. Well, again, he's not saying other countries shouldn't be great. He's saying, I'm the president of this country. And so
I think it's a great expression of authentic nationalism. Some people don't like the idea of nationalism, and they think that's what really led to the First World War. And I suppose there could be some truth to that, an overemphasis on the greatness of one's own nation. But I mean, patriotism is good. It is a virtue, a natural virtue.
Right, and the difference in the bad form of nationalism was, I want my country to be great at your expense. By conquering you. Whereas the difference is President Trump saying, hey, great, be the greatest Poles you can be. I mean, that's great too. We're doing our thing, and we're going to be great as we are. We're not going to let you subjugate us. But it sort of recognizes the true sovereignty and independence of nations in that sense. And that's a good sense of nationalism. You're loyal to your own country. Not a nationalism that is, wants to make yourself great, your country great, by destroying other countries.
Correct. And I loved I don't know if you saw there's a great photo that's been circulating online of President Duda paying homage to Our Lady of Czestochowa, the Black Madonna. I believe it was the day after his reelection, which would have been Monday, July 13th, the anniversary of Our Lady's third apparition at Fatima. So that's another happy coincidence.
Yes, he went to the image, which is, again, the most revered image in Poland, Our Lady of Czestochowa, to pay homage to Our Lady of Czestochowa, which again shows, his attachment to the Catholic and Polish heritage.
Yes, and again, another connection to President Trump, reminiscent of his recent visit to the JP2 shrine and kneeling in front of the crucifix or the image of Our Lady. I forget the exact, I kind of see it in my mind right now, but so yes.
Well, I was thinking more of shortly after his election, the image we've seen of the priest that brought an image of Our Lady of Fatima.
That's right.
The picture of President Trump accepting a statue of Our Lady of Fatima for the White House.
Yes. Yes, we need to continue definitely to pray for President Trump for his conversion. Hopefully he does end up actually coming into the church, and he and Melania can have their marriage, quote unquote marriage situation figured out, regularized.
And again, we commend to our viewers the prayer. We commend to our viewers the prayer composed by Archbishop Viganò for the restoration of Catholicism in this country and the re-election of President Trump that we mentioned in our last broadcast, and commend people to pray that.
Yes, absolutely. Our final story today, we're very excited about this. We posted it on our website, so viewers can go take a look. It's an open letter to Archbishop Viganò and Bishop Schneider, and it was published online in English by our website, CFN, as well as LifeSite News on Wednesday of this week, July 15th. And it's essentially a thank you to Archbishop Viganò and Bishop Schneider for their leadership, specifically in encouraging and reopening discussion about the Second Vatican Council and its connection to the crisis in the church today. So this letter is signed by an original group of 51 scholars, clerics, dignitaries, and journalists, and many more have signed since. I believe the total number of signatories is already, just 2 days after its release, over 90, so that's very encouraging. And I'm going to let Brian explain a little bit more about the impetus for the letter, as he was involved with the drafting and the organization of the initiative.
Yeah, so a couple comments about it. First, it really is a great example of cooperation among, those who are fighting in the cause of the church. So it was really a joint project together with LifeSite News and Catholic Family News, several of our colleagues in Europe, Professor de Mattei, Jean Smets in France, again, to have this letter be published at 2 p.m. Rome time in a multiplicity of languages. And it really showed how we can come together, and importantly in the letter, come together and talk about the critical points. And it's interesting, we'll talk about some of the negative reactions, but the letter is actually very simple in what it says. It doesn't get into detailed positions on specific issues. It really just says thank you to these two prelates for their outspoken calling a spade, right? Saying there's a problem here, we need to deal with it. And that's really all it says is please, and it's addressed to them, but really speaking to the whole hierarchy, right? Saying, we're grateful and please let this discussion continue, right? Because up until now, anyone who raises any voice against the idol of Vatican II is just, go away. It is, as we talked about, the hermeneutic of continuity. It's fine. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, to use the wizard analogy. Everything's fine there. And we just say, look, these have raised legitimate questions which deserve answers. And these are the same questions that were raised in the Dubia of Archbishop Lefebvre, in the letter to the Pope of Archbishop Lefebvre and Bishop de Castromayor in 1983, the theological discussions that we know the Society of St. Pius X entered into with the Vatican in 2011. They're very similar questions to which there's been no answer.
Right. And no matter how long they pound their fist on the table and say it's in continuity, that's not going to answer. It's not going to get rid of the obvious demonstrable problems that show that it's not in continuity on certain points.
Right. And so we, in the letter, thank them, bring that out, and then we just sort of say, let's just create an agenda. And here, again, we didn't get into positions or the nuances, but just took the bishop's own words and said, here are the things.
From their recent interventions,
right,
correct?
From their recent interventions. And we group them under headings. So on the topic of religious liberty, the identity of the church with the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church is the Church of Christ, or the Church of Christ subsists in the Catholic Church. That was raised in Vatican II, that issue. The issue of papal primacy and this new collegiality, and we would add synodality, now that's been taken to its new level by Pope Francis. And the council, the fact that the council and its text are the cause of many current scandals and errors. And we just quote the bishops. Finally, we take a note and say, look, they also, not only in what they're saying, but in the way they did this, are a model for true Catholic discussion. Because the bishops, even though they're saying the same thing, Vatican II is a problem, have been very clear that they take different positions on the solution. Bishop Schneider, to summarize briefly, Bishop Schneider thinks, leave the council more or less there, but correct all of the places where it's a problem. So do a more, go in and remove the tumors from the body, but leave the body there. Whereas we've reported, Archbishop Viganò says, look, the whole thing's tainted. It should just be consigned to the dustbin of history and forgotten and move on. Now, again, they have had some, debate among themselves, saying they disagree, but they've done this in a way that is not ad hominem. They've not attacked one another. They just said, look, here's what we agree on. We have different proposals for a solution, which are in many ways different proposals even from that of Archbishop Lefebvre, right? Archbishop Lefebvre's proposal was essentially, and again, it's true, he was not a theologian or a canonist. He was a pastor, right? And he said, let's just go back to doing what we did before. Let's just have the old catechism, the old mass, the old priesthood, and let the church figure out what to do with Vatican II later. That was more or less his solution, right? He had raised the same concerns about Vatican II, but said, my goal as a pastor and to train priests, as he did for decades in Africa, said, so my solution is I'm just going to train priests the proper way and have the proper mass, and the church can tell us how to deal with this mess. They're proposing it more at the intellectual level. We need to deal with the ideas there. And they make two different proposals on how to correct Vatican II. But the way they do it is what's important, because they don't just hurl excommunications at each other, or you're schismatic, but they respectfully put forward the point where there's room for discussion, right? This is a unique history of the church, unique event, and there's some precedent historically but nothing on this scale of how the church should deal with this. And then finally, as I said, really good cooperative effort. We had 50 people who were involved in the first publication. Some names people will recognize, both in the United States and Europe, but some new people who have, as I scroll down this, not sort of been involved in some of these efforts before. You'll see there's Dr. Peter Hanuski, who contributes to CFN, but Dr. Taylor Marshall has really been doing great work. And it was, again, another part of the Catholic media who cooperated in this effort by being one of the lead signers. And then we also had Judge Andrew Napolitano, who is from the Supreme Court, retired, of New Jersey, and a judicial analyst for Fox News. He did this effort, some name that hasn't really been in some of these more public statements in the past.
Another name that stuck out in regard to being somebody new and significant is Father Richard Heilman, who has a pretty large following. He's a diocesan priest in, I believe it's Madison, Wisconsin.
Yes.
So that's very significant that he's on board with this initiative.
Yes.
As well as Professor Janet E. Smith, who's a well-known, more of a mainstream moral theologian, very strong in defending human life and such. But she's, in the last several months, been discovering tradition and really coming on board with it. So it's very encouraging to see.
Yes, very encouraging. Again, along with those who you'd expect. Chris Ferrara recently added his name shortly after it was published. As I said, Dr. Hanuski, other Marian Bartold, writers you'll see from Catholic Family News. But again, a broad representation, as Matt said, even some diocesan priests, to again just say, let the debate let's have the debate, let's have the discussion in a positive way about and just face facts for what they are, rather than pretend the emperor has clothes when he has no clothes.
Right.
So, but not everybody. The partisans of Vatican II, the diehard party members, were immediately out in force, slinging their diatribe, calling it the Viganò schism has begun. And interestingly, very much in contrast to the message, ad hominem attacks. There's one, for example, that says, "Oh, pay no attention to Viganò. How can we believe this guy? For 55 years, he was a Vatican insider, worked for the inside, and now he's repudiating it." Well, wait, why does that discredit his message? In fact, it makes it more believable.
You're referring to Bishop Thomas Tobin of Providence, Rhode Island, who tweeted that out on the 15th, the day the open letter was published. Yes. Yes,
and exactly. I mean, all this is and again, Archbishop Viganò has been very humble about it, saying, I was wrong for 50 years of my life. But just because I was wrong, and sort of what Tobin is suggesting is, well, you should just stick with being wrong because it's better to be consistently wrong than inconsistent and be right. That's what he's saying. That it would have been better for him to just stay doing the wrong thing, because that's what he'd done for so long.
Something else that stuck out to me from his tweet that's very, I think, unintentionally telling, he actually uses the phrase, the Vatican II Church. Yes. So he's actually admitting, Bishop Tobin, the Vatican II Church obviously is different from what came before it.
Exactly. So all those attacks were out, the crazies. But then there also were the wax lyrical folk about how Vatican II is the greatest thing that ever happened in the church and how great it is. And again, interestingly, since Viganò statements had come out, the Vatican News Service has been publishing lots of articles on how great Vatican II is. George comes out this week after the open letter saying how great Vatican II is. And to just give you a flavor for this effort to sort of celebrate the emperor's lack of clothes, we have this very short video clip from Bishop Barron called "What Was the Actual Purpose of Vatican II?" And 60 years, after 50 years after, well, we're still trying to figure out what its actual, people misunderstood its actual purpose. Well, again, somebody who writes a book where you go, well, we still can't figure out its actual purpose half a century later, tells you it wasn't. You still are arguing about what it meant.
Let me say a word about the council, because you brought that up first. Another great grace in my life was a relationship with the Cardinal George of Chicago. I had the privilege of living with him at least part-time for about 5 years. And of course, he had tremendous reverence for John Paul II. So we talked a lot about him. Cardinal George used to say, what people miss is that Vatican II was a missionary council. He said, unlike, for example, Nicaea, Chalcedon, Trent, even Vatican I, it wasn't there to settle major doctrinal issues. There was indeed doctrinal development at Vatican II. So under the aegis of Newman's notion of development, that certainly happened. But as John the 23rd saw, and Francis George reiterated this, what they wanted to achieve was the act now of bringing the richness and treasures from the church into the world. So like Lumen Gentium, bring the lumen of Christ to the Gentes. That was the purpose of Vatican II. And so some of these adjustments in language and style and strategy that Rocco was talking about, that's all subordinate to the missionary purpose of Vatican II. Rocco cited Balthasar, the great book that he wrote in the 50s called Schleifung der Bastionen, right? The knocking down of the bastions. What he meant was the church, he thought, was crouching too much behind its medieval walls. And it was keeping its treasure, if you want, to itself. The idea was to knock down the walls, not so much to let the modern world in, but to let the church out. Let the beauty and treasure of the church out so as to transform the world. Thanks so much for watching.
So this little defense of Vatican II, just it continues to show the inconsistency of their defense. So notice, first of all, Vatican II was not a doctrinal council. It did not decide matters of doctrine, except when it did. He said it did not change doctrine. Oh, but it did. So again, which is it? This is how they double speak. They say, oh, stop complaining about it. It's in continuity because it didn't change doctrine. Well, except that it did, by their own admission. Secondly, he says, oh, you're misunderstanding. What people still don't get is it was all about a missionary council, about being missionary. Well, again, if we judge things by did they meet their purpose? If I say, I'm going to give a lecture to explain this topic, the way we judge how well I lecture is we say, did you understand the topic? We say, nobody understood that. I failed in my lecture. Well, if that was the purpose of Vatican II, on his own terms, it was a failure. Why? The missions have collapsed. By every metric of conversions to the church, the missions by missionary priests and sisters entering religious life, utter failure. We did not see a flowering of missionary activity, but we saw, in the words of John Paul II himself, a great silent apostasy, a leaving the church, right? Yep. Not a coming into the church. And again, his other contradiction is, oh, well, the whole purpose was to take the treasures of the church and bring them out, take the light and bring the light out. But what did Vatican do in its implementation? It changed the light. It said, well, here we have this light, but you're not going to like this light, so we're going to bring you a different light, right? So it's
and as far as the treasures are concerned, the treasures were tossed onto the trash heap, and new, instead of giving them gems, we gave them these ugly stones covered with moss and said, here's our treasure.
Yes, and if he was right, that was the purpose, then what would we do? We'd be bringing the traditional Latin Mass, the Roman Catechism, right, to new places. But we didn't do that. As Pat said, we brought, instead of bringing those treasures, we brought some plastic imitations of them. So again, it's just it's an incredible contradiction. In a minute and a half, everything's being said is undermining the defense of the council. And this is exactly what a lot of these attacks on Viganò, Archbishop Viganò, and the open letter have been. Oh, you don't appreciate the great things the council's done. But they never really, say, oh, this great missionary effort. Well, where's your proof that it actually did anything? Viganò and Schneider point out the specific harms the council did in specific detail. Right? Archbishop Viganò, if the Pachamama is worshipped in St. Peter's Basilica, that is a direct result of Vatican II. He shows direct results. They just have these vague, oh, Vatican II, everybody misunderstood it, it was really great. And someday we'll appreciate how great it was, even though it didn't change any doctrine, but it did, right? There's no defense there. It's just a walking contradiction.
Yes, and I love sorry, I just want to mention in the open letter, I love that that you all decided to bring up the petition to Benedict XVI, authored by Monsignor Gherardini in, I think that was 2011. And Professor De Mattei also submitted a private petition to Pope Benedict for a re-examination of the council in 2011. And then those two texts were kind of meshed together and made into a petition signed by about 50 Italian theologians and scholars, including Monsignor Gherardini, who has since passed away, and Professor De Mattei, who has signed this current open letter, calling for a thorough re-examination of Vatican II in light of tradition. And as I may have mentioned last week, I wrote a 7-part series on this based on this petition for Catholic Family News back in 2014, and I am going to try and get those articles posted on our website. And I just had a quote come to mind from that petition from the 50 Italian theologians. I'm going to see if I can find it right now. Basically, they say that continuity with tradition cannot simply be asserted without evidence, that it needs to be scientifically demonstrated. In other words, the defenders of Vatican II, like Bishop Barron, for example, need to specifically address the points raised by Archbishop Viganò and Bishop Schneider, saying, Nostra Aetate number 2 or whatever, to give an example, is in continuity because of A, B, C, D. You can't just say because I said so.
Yes.
And basically what the petition from 2011 respectfully said to Benedict XVI is that if you can't do that, if you can't provide an actual demonstration of continuity, then that needs to be honestly admitted and openly admitted.
Yes. Very true, very true. And the last point I'll note in terms of the contradiction here, this little video you watched comes from a project that Bishop Barron, I think, calls the
Hildebrand Project.
The Hildebrand Project.
Yes.
Which seems
apparently
to
it's been.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, yeah, I noticed that really stuck out to me in the notes of the video on YouTube. This series of videos, so this is only one in a series praising the council with Bishop Barron, was produced in cooperation with an organization called the Hildebrand Project, which is something I wasn't familiar with, but it's dedicated to Dr. Dietrich von Hildebrand. And the supreme irony is that Dr. Hildebrand is the same renowned German scholar who actually opposed the new Mass pretty vehemently. There's a letter that he wrote actually to Mr. Alphonse Matt, who was the brother of Walter Matt, the founding editor of The Remnant. His son Michael Matt is the current editor, opposing, and Alphonse Matt was in charge of The Wanderer, who was promoting the new Mass. Dr. von Hildebrand was saying, basically, why are you promoting this? And I can't be a part of that. And also, Dr. Dietrich von Hildebrand and his wife, Dr. Alice von Hildebrand, who's still living, they were personally warned by former communist agent Bella Dodd about the infiltration and subversion of the church from within, which Dr. Alice von Hildebrand has testified to in recent years. 1 Peter 5 a few years ago published an excellent report on that subject. So it's very ironic that Bishop Barron is releasing these videos in concert with the Hildebrand Project when Professor Hildebrand himself was not a fan of the council.
Neither Professor Hildebrand or von Hildebrand were.
Right. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our news roundup for today. We thank you for joining us. And if you've liked this video, we ask that you please click the thumbs up button on YouTube. Give us a thumbs up. It tells YouTube that it's a good video. Also, subscribe to our channel if you're not already subscribed, and hit the notifications bell button. Click on that button to be notified of when we have new content available. We try to release one of these videos every week on Friday. And ultimately, if you enjoy the content that we make available for free on our YouTube channel and our website, we do ask for your support in the form of a subscription to our monthly publication, Catholic Family News, which is it comes in print edition and also an e-edition.
Although at present, we're only able to sell the e-edition because of our administrative office being still closed due to the government shutdowns.
Yes.
So, but you hopefully someday soon we'll be able to continue to sell print copies, but you can always buy instant access to e-edition, which gives you the current month plus all back issues going back several years. So for 1 year, you can get multiple years issues of the paper that will fill all your reading time if you wanted to read them all.
Yes. Yes, and I think we're offering some, the traditional monthly Catholic newspaper. It's really unique. A lot of the content that we're providing to you, you're not going to find anywhere else. So we do ask for your support in helping our apostolate to spread. As Bishop Barron said, we are doing the work of spreading the true treasures of tradition and not the fake imitation
Yes.
version. So
yes, and we're trying to get our August issue out soon, and we've already alluded here. There's a continuing series on Catholic social teaching by Dr. Inuski. I have an article that'll be coming out on Catholics' obligations towards voting in elections, to get us again thinking about coming November, and several other continuing series. So, again, it's
speaking of the Roman Catechism, we have a long-running series that's literally going through the entire Catechism of the Council of Trent. Great series by Matthew Plessy.
Yes.
So yes, please do subscribe if you're not already subscribed, and please tell your family and friends to look into us, CatholicFamilyNews.com. So as we always do, we will close by praying the Hail Mary together and entrusting ourselves, our families, and all of our work to Jesus through Mary. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Our Lady of Fatima,
pray for us. Our Lady of Mount Carmel,
pray for us. Saint Alexius,
pray
for us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.
Well, have a great weekend, and we will see you next week.
Godspeed.